A millionaire left his wife in poverty with their 3 children. 15 years later, he shocked watched her step into a luxury restaurant with another young man. They came closer and said, Sharon Campbell had always felt a certain chill about Houston, Texas, even during the scorching summer months that swept through the Texas River Valley. The house she and her husband, Thomas Weasley, shared was located in a quiet middle-class neighborhood called the Heights. At one time, it had been a place filled with warmth, joy, and their shared hopes for the future. But now, it felt empty, like a hollow echo of the life they had built over their 12 years of marriage. That morning, as Sharon stood in the kitchen, the silence was more suffocating than usual. The kids were at school, and Thomas had already left for work earlier that morning. His routine exit was marked by an absence of any real acknowledgement of her. Sharon had sensed the growing distance between them for months, but she had always chosen not to dwell on it. She had always been the hopeful one, believing that marriage had its ups and downs, and this too would pass. Yet today, something felt off. Her gaze drifted to a folded piece of paper resting on the kitchen counter. A familiar sense of dread settled in her stomach as she reached for it. The paper was of fine quality, the kind Thomas typically reserved for formal business correspondence. With trembling hands, she unfolded it, her heart pounding. Sharon, the letter began, its tone as cold as the dread rising in her chest. I can't do this anymore. Her vision blurred as she read further. Thomas's words were sharp and emotionless, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. He was leaving. For good. He had decided that their life together, their marriage and their children, were no longer what he wanted. He had found someone else, someone who understood him in ways Sharon never could. He was done. The room seemed to spin as the letter slipped from her hands. She collapsed into the nearest chair, gasping for breath. This couldn't be happening. Thomas, the man she had loved and trusted for over a decade, was walking away from it all, leaving her, their children. Her children. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. How could she possibly explain this to them? Michael, their oldest, was only 12. Anthony was just 10, still brimming with the kind of wonder that comes with being a kid. Little Nancy, only 5, was far too young to understand, but old enough to notice his father wasn't around. Sharon gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her knuckles turning pale as she tried to steady herself. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she forced them back. Her mind raced through what was next. How were they supposed to make it without Thomas's paycheck? She had no savings, no job, and no one to turn to for help. A knock at the front door snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. Quickly wiping her eyes, she moved on autopilot, walking toward the door. When she opened it, she found Dorothy, their neighbor from 2 houses down, standing there. Dorothy was in her 50s, with a no-nonsense attitude, but a heart of gold, though she hid it well behind her tough exterior. Dorothy had always been friendly, but their conversations rarely went beyond small talk. "Hey, Sharon," Dorothy greeted, her eyes narrowing as she noticed Sharon's pale face and shaking hands. "You all right?" Sharon forced a smile and nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a rough morning." Dorothy's gaze lingered on her, as if she could see through the surface and sense the chaos beneath. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me," she said, her voice softer than usual. Sharon nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. Dorothy gave her one last concerned look before turning to leave. As soon as the door clicked shut, Sharon collapsed, sliding down the wall until she sat on the floor, knees pulled tight to her chest. The weight of Thomas's betrayal hung over her like a heavy fog. How could he just leave like that? How could he walk away from everything? The next few hours blurred together as Sharon went through the motions of her day. She picked up the kids from school, pasted a smile on her face while listening to their chatter about recess and homework, and somehow managed to make dinner, though she barely registered the taste. The real test came later that night when she tucked them into bed. Michael, his big brown eyes, so much like Thomas's, paused at the door. "Mum?" he asked, his voice small. "When's Dad coming back?" Michael's innocent question tugged at Sharon's heart, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I don't know, honey," she replied softly, trying to sound reassuring. "But we'll be all right." Michael had nodded, though his confused expression showed he wasn't fully convinced. He was starting to sense the growing distance in their family, the tension hanging over them like a dark cloud. After kissing his forehead, Sharon quietly shut his door. The second she was alone, her forced smile vanished. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter from Thomas, which lay before her like a deep, open wound. She had read it over and over, almost wishing the words would magically change. Wishing that she'd wake up from this nightmare and see Thomas walking through the door, apologizing for everything. But that wasn't going to happen. She was alone now, entirely alone. The phone's sudden ring jolted her out of her thoughts. For a split second, hope filled her heart. Could it be Thomas? Maybe he realized he made a mistake and was calling to come back. But as she answered, the voice on the other end wasn't his. It was Mary, Thomas's assistant. Sharon had never cared much for Mary, though she couldn't quite figure out why. Something about her always felt off, cold, and distant. "Sharon," Mary said in a professional, detached tone, "Thomas wanted me to let you know he won't be coming back." Sharon's grip on the phone tightened. In the background, she could hear the busy sounds of an office, keyboards clacking, voices murmuring. Of course, Mary was at work. "I know," Sharon responded, her voice brittle. "He left a note." There was a brief silence, as if Mary hadn't expected Sharon to remain so composed. "He's arranged for financial support," Mary continued. "The first payment will be made by the end of the week." Sharon felt her chest tighten. Arrangements? Financial support? As if their entire life together had been reduced to a simple bank transaction. "I see," she said quietly, her voice empty. Mary hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry, Sharon." But the apology felt as hollow as Sharon's heart. It felt mechanical. None of it seemed real. None of this could possibly be real. That evening, after the phone call ended and the house sank into an unsettling silence, Sharon found herself standing in the living room, staring at the photos arranged on the mantel. The pictures showed moments from her life with Thomas, their wedding day, the kids playing at the park, family trips that now felt like they belonged to someone else. She picked up one of the frames, her fingers lightly tracing the glass. Inside the frame was a photo from their first Christmas together, before the kids were born. Thomas was beaming, his arm wrapped around her waist, his eyes filled with love and hope. But that version of Thomas was gone, and so was the life they once shared. Taking a deep breath, Sharon removed the photo from its frame and tore it in half. The sound of the paper tearing echoed through the quiet room like a final farewell. It was done. Yet as she stood there among the shattered pieces of her past, something began to shift inside her. A quiet resolve slowly started to grow in the pit of her stomach. She refused to let Thomas's betrayal define her. She wasn't going to let him ruin the life she had built with their children. They would persevere. She would persevere because she had no other choice. From that moment on, Sharon Campbell was no longer the woman Thomas had left behind. A new battle had begun. The days after Thomas's departure blurred into a fog of disbelief, anxiety, and quiet desperation. Sharon felt like she was drifting through her own life, each day slipping away as she clung to whatever scraps of normalcy she could. The letter Thomas had left behind still sat on the kitchen counter, now buried under a growing pile of bills she could barely keep up with. It had been 2 weeks since he walked out. 2 weeks of holding it together for the kids, pretending everything was okay, when in reality, everything was crumbling. Each morning, Sharon woke with a heavy feeling in her stomach, wondering how long she could keep up the facade before it all came crashing down. The first real shock hit when she tried to access their joint bank account, only to find it almost drained. Thomas's so-called financial support barely covered the basics for a few weeks, leaving little beyond that. He hadn't left her enough to sustain the life they had lived. Not by a long shot. The mortgage, utilities, groceries, it was all slipping through her hands like sand. That afternoon, Sharon sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the growing stack of bills. A wave of anxiety washed over her, making the home she had shared with her family for over 10 years feel like a trap. The quietness was suffocating, occasionally interrupted by the kids' laughter or their little spats. Every sound reminded Sharon of the fragile world she was trying to hold together. She picked up the electric bill, her eyes locking on the overdue amount. Swallowing hard, she moved on to the next one. Another overdue notice. This time, for a credit card. Her heart raced as she thumbed through each envelope, feeling the weight of their mounting debt crush her. How had it come to this? Sharon had sacrificed everything for Thomas and their family. Her career, her independence, her financial stability, gone. And now, all she had left were these bills and the emptiness that had replaced the life she once knew. As she sat there, the phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. For a brief second, a flicker of hope rose within her. Maybe it was Thomas, calling to make things right, to apologize, to fix what he had broken. But when she answered, it wasn't him. It was the bank, reminding her that the mortgage hadn't been paid for 2 months. Her hands trembled as she promised to make the payment by the end of the month, though she had no idea where she would find the money. After she hung up, the gravity of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. That evening the kids played in the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. Sharon watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart heavy with worry. They had no clue about the storm swirling around them. Michael, Anthony, and Nancy still thought their dad would come back. That all of this was just temporary. Sharon couldn't bear to shatter their innocence. Not yet. She walked into the room, her voice steady as she called out, "Dinner's ready, guys." The kids rushed to the table, their voices filling the room with lively chatter. Sharon forced a smile as she dished out the simple pasta she had managed to prepare from the dwindling food left in the pantry. As she watched them eat, her chest tightened. How long could she keep up this act? How long before the truth became unavoidable? "Mom?" Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. He glanced up from his dinner, his brow knit with concern. "Dad's coming home soon, right? I miss him." Sharon's heart tightened at his words. Michael was only 10, but he was sharp. He'd noticed that Thomas had been gone for a while. Despite Sharon's efforts to comfort him, she knew it was getting harder to keep up the facade. "I know, honey," she said gently, placing a hand over his. "I miss him too. But Dad's busy right now." Michael's frown deepened, but he didn't press for more answers. Sharon could see the confusion in his eyes, the doubt creeping in. He was just old enough to sense that things weren't quite right, but too young to fully grasp what was happening. Nancy and Anthony, still little and blissfully unaware, hadn't started asking questions yet. But Sharon knew it wouldn't be long. After dinner, while the kids were playing in the living room, She found herself back at the kitchen table. The bills were piled up, staring her down. They were a constant reminder of the growing strain. She tapped her fingers on the table, trying to figure out how to dig herself out of this hole. She needed a job, that much was certain. But after years away from working, she didn't even know where to begin. Her degree in social work felt like it was from a different lifetime, and her work experience seemed irrelevant now. The world had moved forward without her, and she was struggling to catch up. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Sharon dusted off her old laptop and started hunting for jobs. Each click felt like a gut punch, driving home just how tough her situation had become. The job market was nothing like she remembered, and the roles she was barely qualified for came with terrible pay and long hours. It wouldn't be enough to cover the bills, let alone support her 3 kids. Still, she applied to anything she could find: receptionist jobs, administrative roles, even part-time work at the local grocery store. It stung to think of starting over, but she didn't have any other options. She needed to keep the lights on, the rent paid, and her kids fed. Hours later, Sharon finally closed the laptop. Her head was pounding from the hours of scrolling, and a heavy sense of despair settled over her. Leaning back in her chair, she closed her eyes as the quiet of the house enveloped her. In the stillness, the weight of everything threatened to crush her. The next morning, Sharon woke up before dawn. Her mind was already spinning with all the tasks she had to handle. There wasn't time to feel bad for herself. In survival mode, there was no space for self-pity. She dressed in a hurry, going through the motions of getting the kids ready for school, packing lunches, making sure they were set for the day. Michael was unusually quiet, his eyes watching her as if he could sense the stress she was trying to mask. "You're going to be late if you don't hurry, buddy," Sharon said, trying to add some cheer to her voice. Michael nodded, but didn't look convinced. "Mum, are we going to be okay?" Sharon froze for a moment, her heart tightening at his question. She kneeled down to his level, locking eyes with him. "We're going to be just fine, Michael. I promise." She hugged him tightly, trying to convince herself of the words as much as she was trying to comfort him. Once the kids left for school, the house grew quiet again, and the silence felt suffocating. Sharon knew she couldn't keep going like this. She needed a plan. She needed support. Later that afternoon, as Sharon sat at the kitchen table, something she had done far too many times recently, there was a knock at the door. Her heart jumped in her chest, and for a brief, irrational moment, she thought it might be Thomas. But when she opened the door, it was her neighbor Dorothy, standing there with a basket of bread and a look of concern on her face. "I've noticed you've been keeping to yourself lately," Dorothy said in her raspy but kind voice. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you needed anything." Sharon blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. "I'm okay, really. Just dealing with a lot." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. No one's okay when their husband walks out on them. Without waiting for an invitation, Dorothy stepped inside and placed the basket on the counter. "Now, I know it's none of my business, Sharon, but I've been where you are. And let me tell you something. You need to ask for help when you need it." Sharon felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone offer help. "I don't even know where to begin," she admitted, her voice small. Dorothy nodded, her expression softening. "You begin by accepting that it's okay not to have everything figured out right now. But you don't have to do this alone, Sharon. You've got those kids to think about, and that means letting people in when they offer a hand." Sharon bit her lip, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had always prided herself on being strong, on holding it all together. Standing in her kitchen now, with Dorothy's steady but compassionate presence beside her, something shifted inside Sharon. It hit her. She wasn't completely on her own, and though that realization seemed small, it was enough to spark a little hope, just enough to keep her going. In the weeks that followed, small but important changes began to happen. Sharon started applying for more jobs, reconnecting with old friends and co-workers, hoping to find something to help her get by. Dorothy was always checking in, offering advice and a sense of security that Sharon didn't even know she needed. It wasn't easy. Some days, the stress felt overwhelming, like the weight of everything was too much to bear. But Sharon was learning something. Surviving wasn't just about paying the bills and keeping the lights on. It was about finding the strength to carry on. Even when things felt impossible, she knew the road ahead was long. But for the first time, since Thomas had left, Sharon felt a glimmer of hope. Small and delicate, but there. And for now, that was enough. 15 years had passed since Thomas Campbell walked out of the home he had built with Sharon and their 3 children. He had left chasing the dream of a bigger, more thrilling life, one filled with money, success, and freedom. Now, standing in his cramped apartment, staring out over the city that had once been his playground, Thomas realized how wrong he had been. The Anati skyline shimmered in the late afternoon sun, its glass and steel towers reflecting the light in a way that reminded Thomas of his past victories. There was a time when this view had belonged to him. A time when he was the one landing million-dollar deals, attending fancy parties with powerful people, and growing his business empire. Now he could barely afford the rent on his small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The downfall had started slowly, barely noticeable at first, like a tiny crack in a dam. After leaving Sharon, Thomas had thrown himself into his business, convinced that his personal life had been holding him back. At first, things were great. His investments were booming, and his circle of contacts expanded. He felt unstoppable, untouchable. And then came Tiffany. Tiffany was young, gorgeous, and driven. Thomas's life had taken a sharp turn when she swept in, full of energy and excitement, making him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. She was everything Sharon wasn't, bold, glamorous, and fully immersed in the high-stakes world of finance where Thomas thrived. For a while, she made him believe his dreams were within reach, but Tiffany's lifestyle came with a steep price. She had a taste for the extravagant, lavish vacations, designer wardrobes, and high-end properties. Desperate to prove he was still the man he thought he was, Thomas catered to her every desire. At first, the spending didn't seem like a problem. His income could handle it, until it couldn't. The first major hit came when a real estate deal he'd sunk millions into went belly up. It was supposed to be a sure thing, a towering office building in the heart of Houston's tech hub, but delays, ballooning costs, and a sudden market slump turned the project into a financial disaster. As the debt mounted and investors bailed, Thomas scrambled to patch the sinking ship. Predictably, Tiffany didn't stick around to see the collapse. The moment the money started to run dry, she vanished, taking the last of his liquid assets with her. He hadn't heard from her since. What followed was a slow, painful decline. One by one, the deals Thomas had banked on fell apart. Desperation set in, and he threw himself into one risky investment after another, hoping for a quick win that never materialized. His once thriving business was now a shadow of its former self, and the colleagues who once admired him now gossiped about his downfall. Through it all, thoughts of Sharon and the kids haunted him. He hadn't reached out in years, too ashamed to face them. He convinced himself they were better off without him, that they'd moved on. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had let them down, just as badly as he had let himself down. Meanwhile, across town, Sharon Campbell sat in her sleek modern office overlooking the very tech district where Thomas's dreams had crumbled. Sunlight poured through the large windows, bathing the room in a cozy golden light. Sharon leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers gently on the smooth wooden desk as she looked over the latest numbers for her consulting business. What had begun as a small side hustle to earn some extra money when her kids were younger had grown into something far more significant over the past 10 years. As her network expanded and her reputation as a thoughtful, capable leader spread, the business took off. Now, Sharon was offering advice to top startups and non-profit organizations in the city, guiding them through the complex waters of scaling, securing funding, and making a difference in their communities. Glancing around her office, she couldn't help but be amazed by how far she'd come. This wasn't the future she had envisioned when she married Thomas, but it was a future she had built brick by brick. And it wasn't just about the financial security, though that was certainly a huge relief. What meant more was the inner strength she had uncovered, the resilience she had cultivated during some of the toughest times. After Thomas left, Sharon faced more hurdles than she could count. The early days were especially rough. Struggling to stay afloat, she was fortunate when an old friend, Denise, reached out and offered her a position at a local non-profit. It wasn't glamorous work at first, just admin duties and overseeing volunteers, but Sharon's natural gift for connecting with others, along with her growing expertise, quickly earned her a leadership role. That's when everything began to shift. The non-profit world opened up opportunities she hadn't imagined. She became known not just for her hard work, but for her ability to see the needs of both organizations and the communities they served. As a result, when she started her consulting business a few years later, clients flocked to her because of her reputation for being sincere, motivated, and insightful. And it wasn't just her career that was thriving. Sharon's kids had grown into remarkable young adults, each finding their own way. Nancy, now in her 20s, was in graduate school studying psychology, with a deep passion for helping others, just as Sharon had helped guide her family. Anthony, now 25, was working in the finance world, but his strong sense of ethics set him apart from the ruthless business practices that had once consumed his father. And then there was Michael. Michael had been just a little boy when Thomas walked out, too young to fully grasp what had happened. As Michael grew older, though, it was obvious he had inherited his father's sharp intellect and ambition. Unlike Thomas, Michael chose to channel his talents into something positive. At just 27, he had founded a cybersecurity startup that quickly gained traction in Houston's tech industry. The business grew fast, catching the eye of investors from all over the country. Eventually, a wealthy oil tycoon made an offer to buy the company for millions, making Michael a multimillionaire before turning 30. Sharon couldn't help but smile when she thought about Michael and all he had achieved. He had worked tirelessly to create something from nothing, and she couldn't be prouder. Yet she also knew there was a part of him that still longed for the father who had left them. Michael rarely talked about Thomas, even as he got older and the memories of his father started to blur. The pain of being abandoned never fully went away. Sharon had done her best to fill that void, but deep down, she knew it hadn't been enough. Michael had built up walls around that part of himself. Though he seldom expressed his feelings, Sharon noticed the pain in his eyes whenever Thomas's name came up. She hadn't expected Michael to show any interest in his father's whereabouts. For years, they had moved on with their lives without Thomas's presence hanging over them. But lately, Michael has started asking questions, quiet, careful questions about where Thomas was, what had happened to him, and if he has ever tried to reach out. Sharon didn't want to push. She knew Michael had to navigate the complex emotions surrounding his father's absence in his own way. Still, a part of her worried. worried that seeing Thomas again might bring back old hurt, that Michael would end up getting hurt all over again. One chilly November evening, Sharon got a text from Michael. It was short and direct, but it made her stop in her tracks. "Dinner tonight? I've got some big news." Sharon smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Michael had always shared his successes with her, from his first winning business presentation to the milestones of his booming company. She responded to his text quickly, agreeing to meet him at their go-to spot downtown. As she drove through the streets of Houston, the city lights flickered in the cool evening air. Sharon's thoughts drifted back to the tough times when she survived on little more than grit and optimism. She remembered those endless nights, stressing over how to cover the bills and ensure her children had a future. And now she was on her way to meet her son, now a self-made millionaire, for dinner. When she arrived, the restaurant buzzed with energy. The dim candlelight and soft murmur of conversations filled the space. Michael was already at a table in the back, looking sharp in his custom suit, his hair neatly combed. He had grown into such a confident, successful man. Sharon's heart filled with both pride and amazement as she walked over. "Mom," Michael greeted her, standing up to give her a hug. "You look fantastic." "You too," she said with a warm smile. "So, what's the big news?" Sharon asked. Michael paused for a moment, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening in. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping yet brimming with excitement. "I just closed a huge deal," he said. "How huge?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Michael grinned. "We're branching out into cybersecurity for energy infrastructures. I just partnered with one of the biggest oil companies in Texas. This is going to be massive." Sharon's eyes widened in amazement. "Michael, that's unbelievable. I'm so proud of you." As they chatted, catching up on Michael's business ventures, Sharon felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had worried endlessly about how her kids would turn out, especially after Thomas left. But, sitting here, watching Michael exceed all expectations, she realized she had done something right. But as the night went on, she noticed a subtle change in Michael's demeanor. A flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. He shifted in his seat, his smile faltering just a little. "Mum," he said quietly, his voice softer now. "There's something else." Sharon felt her chest tighten. "What is it?" she asked. Michael took a deep breath, looking her straight in the eye. "I've been looking into Dad." The air between them seemed to freeze. The mention of Thomas's name weighed heavily in the room. Sharon felt her breath catch in her chest. She hadn't been expecting this. Not now. "And yet," she asked, her voice barely audible. "I found him," Michael said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "He's still in Houston. He's lost almost everything." Sharon's stomach turned. For years, she had tried to leave Thomas in the past, to move forward without letting his memory haunt her. But now, even if just in spirit, he was back. "So, what do you want to do?" Sharon asked, her tone soft yet firm. Michael clenched his jaw. "I want to see him. He needs to know what he missed out on. He needs to see who I've become." Sharon's heart ached for her son. She had always known this day would come, and that Michael would seek some form of closure. But she also knew the man Michael was eager to confront might not be the man he'd find. "Just be careful," Sharon whispered, reaching across the table to hold Michael's hand. "Don't let him take away everything you've built." Michael nodded, his face unreadable. "I won't. But I need to do this." And in that moment, Sharon knew the past, no matter how deeply buried, was about to come back in ways none of them could avoid. The crisp autumn air swept through the streets of Houston as Thomas Campbell walked down a familiar road. his coat wrapped tight against the cold. The glow of the city's booming tech hub lay ahead, with its gleaming skyscrapers reflecting the fading light. His breath clouded in the frosty air, yet inside, he felt numb. It had been years since Thomas had felt any real connection to this part of town. It was a place that once represented his future, a future that had slipped away like sand through his fingers. The years had not been kind to him. His wealth, once immense, had nearly vanished. The friends he had during his climb to success no longer answered his calls. He had become invisible in the city he once ruled. A shadow. And yet, here he was, drawn back to a restaurant he hadn't set foot in for over a decade. A place that had once been the symbol of his triumph. It had once been the backdrop for many business dinners and special events. It was the place where deals were signed, connections were forged, and where he had basked in the wealth he believed would last forever. But that was in a different life. Thomas stopped just outside the restaurant, gazing in through the window at the softly lit, cozy scene within. For a brief second, he considered turning away, heading back to the small, dreary apartment where he now spent most of his time. Yet, something pulled him toward the door. Maybe it was the desire to feel, even for one evening, like the man he used to be. Even if it was only for show, he opened the door and walked inside. The restaurant hadn't changed much. The lighting was still dim, the atmosphere filled with the quiet murmur of conversation, occasionally interrupted by the sound of clinking glasses and cutlery. Thomas hesitated near the entrance, slightly disoriented as the maître d' approached. "Good evening, sir. Table for one?" Thomas nodded, too worn out to speak. The maître d' guided him to a small table tucked into the back corner of the room. It was far from the prime spots he once commanded, but that didn't matter anymore. He wasn't there for the view. As he sat and scanned the room, his gaze locked onto a scene that made his heart skip a beat. There, at a table not too far from his, was Sharon. She looked different, but not in the way Thomas had expected. Time had been far kinder to her than it had been to him. Her once long, wild hair was now sleek and pulled into a simple ponytail. She wore a soft, elegant sweater that gave her a warm, peaceful glow, making her fit perfectly in this refined setting. She was laughing, really laughing, and the sound caused a painful twist in Thomas's chest. But it wasn't just Sharon's presence that sent a shockwave through him. It was the man sitting across from her, a young guy, sharply dressed, with a confidence and poise that felt strangely familiar. Thomas couldn't quite place it at first. The man's relaxed posture, his assured manner, the way he leaned in slightly as he spoke, it all seemed so natural. He was clearly someone important. As Thomas continued to watch, his heart began to pound faster. Who was this man? Had Sharon moved on? His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them could prepare him for the truth that was about to hit him. Just then, the young man turned his head, and their eyes met. Thomas's world came to a standstill. It was Michael, his son. For a long, stunned moment, Thomas just sat there, his mind spinning with the realization. Michael was no longer the little boy he had left behind. Now he was a grown man who, by the looks of it, had achieved things Thomas had never dreamed of. The truth struck Thomas like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. He hadn't laid eyes on Michael in years. He had walked away when Michael was just a kid, too wrapped up in his own ambition to care about the life he had left behind. And now, here was Michael, seated in a fancy restaurant, wearing a sharp suit, chatting with his mother, as if Thomas had never even existed. Thomas's hands curled into fists under the table as shame and regret swept over him. He wanted to bolt before they spotted him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to face the mess he had created, but he couldn't move. his feet glued to the floor, his body frozen as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He could see Sharon's face more clearly now. She was smiling, her eyes bright as she listened to Michael. There wasn't a trace of sadness, no sign of the broken woman he had left behind all those years ago. She had moved on, built a life without him. And Michael, he had become someone remarkable, someone Thomas had never been able to be for him. Just as Thomas was about to look away, Michael glanced up, and their eyes met. There was recognition for a split second, then surprise, and finally, something darker. Michael's face hardened. His eyes narrowed as he studied the man who had been nothing more than a shadow in his life. He leaned back in his chair and said something to Sharon that Thomas couldn't make out. She turned to see what Michael was looking at. For the first time in 15 years, their eyes met. Thomas's stomach churned. Sharon's expression gave nothing away, neither anger nor shock, just calm. She said something else to Michael, then gave a small nod toward Thomas's table, as if confirming what Michael already suspected. Thomas's heart sank as he realized they had known he was there the whole time. Michael stood, his movements controlled and deliberate, and walked across the room toward Thomas. Thomas's hands grow clammy as his son approaches. The boy, no, the man he had abandoned, was now standing in front of him, tall and commanding. Michael didn't sit. He stood there, staring down at his father with an intensity that made Thomas feel like a child again, small and insignificant in the presence of an adult. For a while, neither of them said a word. The space between them was thick with years of things left unsaid. Michael broke the silence first, his voice cold and cutting. "Finally, I get to see the man who walked out on his family." Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat tightened, and his thoughts were a mess of regrets and excuses. What could he say to Michael? How could he possibly explain all the years he'd been gone? The decisions that had brought them to this moment. I didn't know you'd be here," Thomas stammered, the words sounding weak even to himself. "Of course," Michael replied, his expression unchanged. "You wouldn't have shown your face if you did." Thomas winced at the truth in his son's words. He hadn't come to see them. He wasn't there to make things right or to deal with the consequences of his actions. He was there because he was lonely. He craved some reminder of the life he used to have. But Michael wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, speaking in a low voice so only Thomas could hear. "Do you even realize what you missed?" Michael asked, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Do you have any clue what you gave up when you left us?" Thomas's heart raced in his chest. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but what could he say? He had left them. He had walked away, and now standing before him was the result of his failure. His son was successful, strong, and completely indifferent to him. Michael stood taller, his eyes locked on Thomas's. "You missed everything, and now you'll never get it back." With that, Michael turned and walked away. His footsteps were quiet, but there was no doubt they were final. Thomas watched him walk back to Sharon, who gently placed her hand on Michael's arm and nodded toward the door. Together, they left the restaurant, leaving Thomas sitting alone. The weight of his past hit him like a tide. Even after they had left, Thomas sat there in silence for a long time, the empty plate in front of him untouched. His mind replayed the conversation over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. Michael had been right. He had missed it all. He had missed watching his kids grow up, missed their achievements, their challenges, and their lives. And now, there was nothing left for him. The realization settled over Thomas like a heavy fog. He had lost his family, his fortune, and any hope for the future. And what was left now was an empty diner, an empty life, and a son who would never forgive him. As Thomas finally rose to leave, the world beyond the glass doors felt colder than it had before. The night had deepened, the city lights stretching shadows across the street like long, dark fingers. He moved slowly, his head down, burdened with regret. There was no redemption in sight for Thomas Campbell. His decisions had been made years ago, and now he was stuck living with the aftermath, all on his own. The night air wrapped around Thomas like a bitter reminder as he wandered through the streets of Houston. The biting wind stung his face, but he barely felt it. His mind churned with regret, shame, and something even darker, a hollow emptiness gnawing at him from the inside out. His run-in with Michael and Sharon had rattled him deeply. His son, standing tall, confident and strong, had looked down at him with nothing but scorn. Michael was right. Thomas had missed it all. For years, he convinced himself that walking away was the best choice, that chasing his ambition, craving more than what he had, justified leaving his family behind. But now, staring down the truth of all he had sacrificed, his flimsy justifications crumbled to dust. The pride that had once shielded his heart gave way, leaving him with nothing but the raw sting of his past mistakes. Michael's words still rang in his ears as he returned to his small, dimly lit apartment. The place felt even more stifling than usual. He couldn't shake the memory of how Michael had looked at him, as if he were nothing. And Sharon? She hadn't even given him more than a fleeting glance. She didn't need to. Her success, her happiness, everything she had built without him, said more than words ever could. For years, Thomas had pushed away any thought of Sharon and the kids, drowning himself in his work, his reckless deals, and his obsession with the life he thought he deserved. But now, with those distractions gone, all that remained was the crushing weight of his failures. He poured himself a drink, watching the amber liquid swirl in the glass as he gazed out over the city. Houston, once the center of his universe, now seemed distant, cold, like it belonged to someone else. His reflection in the window stared back at him, older, grayer, shattered. He no longer recognized the man he had become. Taking a long, deep swig, he felt the burn of the alcohol slide down his throat, but it did little to dull the ache inside. He had always believed that success was the ultimate goal, and that money, power, and prestige were the only things worth striving for. But now, standing amidst the wreckage of what was once his empire, he realized that those things had never truly been his. They were temporary and empty, and in chasing them, he had sacrificed what truly mattered. His family, his honor, his sense of direction, gone. The ringing of the phone pierced the stillness of the room. Thomas glanced at it, his heart skipping with the ridiculous hope that maybe, just maybe, it was Michael. But when he answered, the voice on the line was unfamiliar. "Mr. Campbell," the voice said, cold and professional, "this is J.P. Morgan Co. We're calling about your overdue debts. We've sent multiple notices, and your payment is now 3 months behind. If we don't receive payment by the end of the week, we'll have no choice but to move forward with legal action." A wave of nausea hit Thomas. He had been ignoring the calls, the emails, and the letters. There was no money left. His businesses had all collapsed, one after another. His haphazard investments, extravagant spending, and vain attempts to hold on to a way of life that had long since vanished had all but destroyed his once sizable wealth. "I understand," Thomas responded, his voice flat. "I'll see what I can do." He hung up, but the crushing weight of the debt remained, tightening around him like a vice. There was no escaping it. No more clever plans, no deals to strike, no lifelines left. He was sinking, and no one was there to save him. Thomas slumped into the old armchair by the window, glass still in hand. He stared blankly at the city skyline, his thoughts drifting back to that brief, agonizing moment at the restaurant when he saw Michael, so sure of himself, so in control. It felt like the universe was rubbing his face in his own defeat. Michael had become everything Thomas had once dreamed of being, and he'd done it without Thomas. That truth hurt, but it was undeniable. Michael had built a career, a legacy, a life. He had succeeded in ways Thomas could never have envisioned, all without the father who had walked out on him. Meanwhile, across town, Michael sat in his penthouse, the lights of Houston sparkling beneath him. The dinner with Sharon had gone smoothly enough, but the meeting with his father left him unsettled. He had gone there to show Thomas what he had missed out on, to throw his success in the face of the man who had never been there for him. But now, sitting in the stillness of his apartment, Michael felt a deep sense of dissatisfaction gnawing at him. He had expected to feel victorious. He had hoped to leave that restaurant feeling vindicated, like he had finally gotten the closure he'd been searching for. Instead, he felt empty, hollow. Seeing Thomas like that, old, defeated, almost pitiful, didn't give him the satisfaction he'd imagined. In fact, it left him with a sense of sadness. Michael shook his head, trying to brush off the feeling. He owed Thomas nothing. He had built his company from scratch, clawed his way to the top with hard work and determination. He had given Sharon and his siblings a life of comfort and stability, something Thomas had never provided. He had proven without a doubt that he didn't need his father. And yet, seeing Thomas older, broken and alone, tugged at something deep inside him that he hadn't expected. Part of him had hoped that maybe Thomas would try to explain himself, that he'd apologize, show some kind of remorse for abandoning the family. But Thomas had said nothing. He had just stood there, speechless, as Michael laid out the truth of what he'd lost. Michael poured himself a drink and sank into the leather chair by the window. He glanced at his phone, thinking about calling Sharon, but decided against it. She had seen the same thing he had. She had lived with the consequences of Thomas's abandonment for years. She didn't need to rehash it, but as Michael sipped his drink, a troubling thought crept into his mind. Had he really confronted Thomas for closure, or had he done it to prove something to himself? Had he gone there to show his father what he had become? Or had he been trying to convince himself that he didn't need Thomas's approval? The question hung in the air, unsettling and unresolved. A few days later, Sharon sat in her office, the afternoon sun pouring through the large windows. She had been busy, as always, juggling the demands of her consulting business and managing her children's lives. But something had been gnawing at her since that night at the restaurant. Since Michael had confronted Thomas, she couldn't shake the look in Michael's eyes when he came back to the table after facing his father. There was a coldness, a bitterness that Sharon was all too familiar with. Yet beneath that tough exterior, something gentler seemed to linger. Maybe it was disappointment, or perhaps it was sadness. Sharon hadn't mentioned it to Michael back then, giving him space to process everything on his own terms. She knew he needed to come to his own conclusions. But now, days later, the thought that Michael might be carrying more than he let on wouldn't leave her alone. Her phone buzzed, breaking her chain of thought. She glanced down and saw Michael's name flashing on the screen. "Hey, Mom," his voice came through the speaker, steady but soft. "Can we talk?" "Of course, Michael," Sharon replied warmly. "What's going on?" A brief silence followed on the other end. "I've just been thinking about Dad," Michael said after a pause, his words heavy with emotion. Sharon felt a familiar ache in her chest. She knew this conversation was bound to happen. "What about him?" she asked, her voice gentle. Michael let out a long sigh. "I thought seeing him again would give me some closure, you know. I thought I'd feel better, but I don't." Sharon closed her eyes, her heart hurting for her son. She had wrestled with the same unresolved emotions for years, feelings that had stayed long after Thomas had left their lives. "I know," she said softly. "It's not easy, Michael. Closure doesn't always show up the way we expect." "I'm not sure I was even looking for closure," Michael admitted, his voice conflicted. "I think I just wanted to prove something, to him and to myself." Sharon leaned back, her tone reassuring yet firm. "Michael, you don't have to prove anything to him. The life you've built speaks volumes. You've achieved more than he could have ever imagined." "But it still feels hollow," Michael said, his frustration clear. "No matter what I do, I can't seem to let go of this anger, this disappointment." Sharon got it. She had spent years struggling with the same thoughts, trying to reconcile the man Thomas was with, the man she wished he had been. "You're allowed to feel disappointed, Michael," she said softly. She spoke softly. "He wasn't the father you deserved, and that's not on you." On the other end of the line, there was only silence, but Sharon could sense the depth of Michael's emotions. "Thanks, Mum," he eventually replied, his voice quieter now. "I just needed to let it out." The conversation lingered in Sharon's mind for days after. Thomas's sudden reappearance in their lives had stirred something in Michael, whether Thomas had meant to or not. Sharon had hoped that the years of success and growth they had achieved without him would have mended those old wounds. Yet she knew that some scars remain, no matter how much time goes by. It had taken Sharon years to come to terms with Thomas's abandonment, to accept that the man she once loved had chosen a path of self-centered pursuit, leaving her and their kids behind. She had managed, though, slowly, painfully, but with a strength that even surprised herself. She had raised her children to be resilient, independent, and compassionate, and they had thrived. But something else was brewing within Sharon, an unfinished story. Though she had moved forward and built a new life, she never had the opportunity to face Thomas, to look him in the eye and tell him the impact his desertion had on their family and on her. Now, with Michael struggling with unresolved feelings about his father, she knew it was time. One chilly, overcast afternoon, Sharon found herself outside the building where Thomas now lived. The modest apartment building was a far cry from the grand home they once shared, a stark reminder of the life Thomas had gained and then lost. Her heart raced as she stood on the sidewalk, staring at the dull brick exterior. For years, Sharon had rehearsed this moment in her mind. But now, standing on the brink of finally confronting him, the words she had practiced felt distant and hard to grasp. She hadn't told Michael she was coming. This was something she needed to do for herself, not for Michael, and not for Thomas. Taking a deep breath, Sharon stepped inside and walked toward the elevator. The short ride to the third floor felt like it stretched on forever as her thoughts swirled. She tried to steady herself, reminding herself of the life she had built and the inner strength she had found. She was no longer the same woman Thomas had left all those years ago. She was stronger now. As the elevator doors slid open, she stepped into the narrow hallway and made her way toward Thomas's apartment. Her footsteps were faint, but in the stillness of the corridor, each sound seemed to amplify, carrying her closer to the man who used to be her husband. When she raised her hand to knock, it shook ever so slightly. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. Then, from behind the door, she heard the quiet shuffle of footsteps, followed by the unmistakable clink of a deadbolt turning. The door creaked open, revealing Thomas Campbell. Time had taken its toll on him. His once rich, dark hair had faded to grey, now thinning at the sides. He no longer exuded the sharpness, a sense of certainty and confidence in favor of something softer, almost weary. His eyes, once filled with ambition, were now dulled, clouded with the weight of regret and fatigue. He stared at her, a mix of shock and uncertainty in his gaze. "Sharon?" he rasped, his voice rough, as if it hadn't been used much recently. "Why are you here?" Sharon drew in a deep breath, gathering her composure before speaking. "I need to talk to you, Thomas." He hesitated, glancing down the hallway, as if expecting someone else to appear. Then, reluctantly, he stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was small and barely furnished. It was a far cry from the luxury Thomas once lived in. The walls were blank, and the furniture looked old and tired. A lone window overlooked the city, casting a pale grey light that stretched shadows across the room. Sharon stood in the center of the living room, her eyes roaming over the sparse surroundings, taking in the signs of Thomas's downfall. It was hard to believe that this was the same man she had once built a life with. The man who had been so sure of his success that he had abandoned his family to pursue it. "I didn't expect this," Thomas muttered, breaking the silence. He walked over to the small kitchen table and gestured for her to sit. After a brief hesitation, she sat down, her posture rigid and determined. "You left us," Sharon started, her voice steady, but thick with years of unspoken feelings. "You didn't just leave me, Thomas, you left the kids." "You didn't just walk away from our marriage," she continued. "You walked away from your family." Thomas lowered his head, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. He didn't argue or deny it. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what I did." "For years I've tried to figure it out," Sharon continued, her voice rising slightly. "I've tried to understand how you thought it was okay to leave me with 3 kids, no money, and no help. Why did you think your job and your goals mattered more than us?" Thomas winced, but stayed silent. He couldn't say anything. He had no defense, no explanation that would make it right. "I've moved on," Sharon said, her tone calming. "I've rebuilt my life. Our kids, they're thriving. They've become strong, capable adults, and they did it without you." Thomas's eyes welled up with tears. "I'm proud of them," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've always been proud of them. I didn't know how to come back. I didn't know how to fix what I did." Sharon shook her head, her eyes piercing him. "It's not about fixing it, Thomas. You can't undo what you did. You can't take back the pain and the years you missed. You can't return the time you took from them." Thomas swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. "I know," he whispered, barely audible. "I know I can't." The silence between them grew heavy, years of pain settling in the space. Sharon let the quiet linger, allowing Thomas to sit with the weight of what he had lost. After what felt like forever, she spoke again. "I didn't come here for an apology," she said softly. "And I didn't come to forgive you. I came to tell you I've moved on. I've made a life without you. And so have the kids." Thomas nodded, his face full of sorrow. "I understand." Sharon stood, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had finally said everything she'd held inside for so long. She didn't need anything more from him. She didn't need closure or redemption or even forgiveness. She had her own life, her family, and that was enough. As she turned to leave, Thomas called out one last time, his voice trembling with regret. "Sharon," he called after her. "I'm sorry. I really am." She paused for a moment, still facing away. She gave a small nod, more to herself than to him, before turning and stepping outside. The evening sun was setting as Sharon left the building, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink. She paused on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the cool night air, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Thomas was part of her past, a chapter that had closed a long time ago. And now, standing here in the quiet dusk, she knew she had finally let go of the burden he'd left behind. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to the moment. It was a message from Michael. "Hey Mum, dinner at my place tonight. I've got some great news to share." Sharon smiled, her heart warming with pride for her son and the man he had grown into. She quickly replied, "I'll be there." As she headed toward her car, Sharon was filled with gratitude for the life she had built and the family she had nurtured. Driving away from that old part of her life, leaving Thomas behind for good, she realized that her best days were still ahead. For Sharon Campbell, the hardest part was over. The future was hers to create. Meanwhile, Thomas sat alone in his apartment, the silence closing in on him like an endless void. The weight of his choices, his failures, bore down on him more heavily than ever. He had wished for another chance, a way to make things right. But now he understood that some things just couldn't be repaired. As the night pressed in, Thomas finally realized he was truly and irrevocably alone. Years ago, she had given up her career to raise their kids and to stand by Thomas as he pursued his climb to the top.